Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
out. And there's no. No. Well, that was an interesting development. Sorry for the delay. The room change was announced, was told to me, but I did not properly take into account. Well done to those who made it to the room without, directly, rather than going to the normal place first. But here we are now. Fortunately, we have a reasonably short lecture today, and there's some stuff at the end which was sort of optional stuff that I might get to if I have time. But two things. Fortunately, we won't have time anyway because of the delay, and in any case, it requires a document camera, which I was told would be in this room, but which, in any change rooms that we get, but which isn't in this room. So we can't do the last stuff anyway, we can't do the extra stuff that we might do if we have time for anyway, so that'll be fine. I also don't have a clicker button, which is super annoying. So we'll get started. So today we're going to, yes, sorry. As far as I'm aware, today is being recorded, yes. It should be being recorded. This is very, very loud, this mic. Is it really, really loud? Yes. I can try and just turn it down. Maybe it's this one. Is that better? Better? Much better. Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about cost of living and productivity. Last time was a really was a lecture which was really being heavily based on data and on the past, and today we're going to be moving beyond. We're going to not talk anywhere near as much about how things used to be. We're going to be really talking about how things are now. A few quick so we'll go through some admin stuff, we'll talk about cost of living, and then we'll talk about production functions, so aggregate production functions, the entire economy. A few quick admin things. Regarding help desk and office hours, quite a lot of people have come and asked me about whether they can make a booking for time during the office hours or during the help desk times. And I just want to be really, really clear that for these times, and these times are on Wattle, but they're on Wednesdays and Thursdays and Fridays, and Tuesdays as well, I think. You don't need a booking. These are just drop-in things. If you want to come in and talk to a tutor or to myself, you just come along to these help desk or office hours times. There's no need for a booking. They're usually pretty underrepresented in the sense of, or underutilized. So there's, apart from the week that the problem set is due, or the week before the problem set is due, there's tons and tons of time when you can just rock up and talk to us. And it's, we're here for you to drop in whenever you like. There's no need for a booking. There's no need to have, a full set of, written down carefully correlated questions that you want to ask. You can come in and be like, I really struggled with this bit because I wasn't quite sure how the tutor went from A to B or from B to C, and the tutor and the person there will sort of work through it with you, and that's great. A quick note on upcoming assessments, which is the only other part of admin. Just because there's a few when they're upcoming. The personal project is due Tuesday of week 11. Problem set 2 is unfortunately due in the same week. It's a bit annoying, but it's the way things are. I'm going to justify this by saying you've had the personal project for a while. I know some people have already finished their personal project. So hopefully the personal project, you can think of it as being due on Friday of week 10. And then you have nothing due in the same week. The problem set 2 will be due Friday of week 11. The final exam will be Wednesday of what I'm calling week 13. So it's the week immediately after week 12. There's very little turnaround time there. We have one of the earliest exams. The exam is the first day of the exam period in the afternoon of the first day of the exam period. So it's only 6 days after the last lecture. There will be additional help desk times around that final exam, particularly on the Friday, Monday, and Tuesday. This one will be holding additional help desk times, which have not been organised yet at all, but I'm letting you know now. That's all I have. Any questions? Questions, concerns? Yes. Problem set 2 has not been released. It will be released at least 1 week and no more than 2 weeks before the due date. Problem set will cover, it's due on Friday week 11, so it will only cover up to stuff that was done in week 9 lectures, which is next week. Yeah, because it'll be week 10 tutorials. No, I realized that problem set 1 was a bit longer than I initially intended, so it will be shorter than problem set 1. Not significantly shorter, but it will be shorter than problem set 1. Problem set 1 was really designed to give you a taste of the style of question that would be in the mid-semester exam. That was the point of problem set 1. I don't have to have that again in problem set 2 because you know what my exams look like now because you've just done one. So I can make it a bit shorter or a bit different.
For the personal project, are you able to share HD level?
I have. There's 3. Well, there's 3 up online. So those were amongst the best ones when I ran a similar program for undergraduates. So they're HD level for undergraduates. I've not done this question before for a graduate course like this course before, so I would anticipate HD level would be higher in this course. But those were good assignments. Those were well-structured, well-written, interesting assignments. Those 3 that I posted. They all could have been better, and they would probably all be distinctions in this course. Distinctions or good distinctions in this course. Is that okay? Yep. Otherwise, any questions, problems? That admin stuff. Okay, so if I'm going to stand behind the lectern a lot more than usual, it's because I don't have a pointer. Okay, so last week we talked a lot about GDP, and talking about GDP was really good. GDP is really nice, though as we talked about last week, not absolutely perfect, on Monday, for talking about production in the economy, right? If our question is how much is our economy producing, GDP is pretty good at that. If our question is standard of living, GDP is okay, but not great. So there's pros and cons. But what we're going to talk about today is something else, which is we want to think about cost of living, not just standard of living, but how much it costs to live in our society. And so for that, we want to have some way of measuring the change in prices. We're going to talk about the change in prices as the cost of, or the prices of stuff as the cost of living. We're going to talk about 2 main measures, and I'll mention a few others at the end, but there's going to be 2 main measures that we think about. We're going to think about the GDP deflator and the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Hopefully all of you have heard of something like the CPI before. Probably not many of you have heard of the GDP deflator before. They're ultimately pretty similar, but they do have some differences, as we will see. I'm going to do the GDP deflator first because it's less important, but it flows really neatly from what we talked about last week. CPI is a much more important measure of cost of living, but GDP deflator is, as I say, it just flows really naturally and easily from the work we did last time. So the GDP deflator in a given year is just the ratio between nominal GDP and real GDP. And for a lot of these things, we multiply by 100 because people like multiplying by 100 for some reason. But this is what we call the GDP deflator. It's this ratio between nominal GDP and the real GDP. That's it. That's what it is. There's not much else I can say here. Any questions, concerns? Yeah. We'll see it in action a little bit, and that'll give us some insight when we go through an example. Yep. Yes. When you take the base year, so it's on this slide, I think. So GDP deflated depends on the target year, so the 2019 as we have here, and also on the choice of base year. And so it's not a measure in and of itself. All textbooks and everything always write something like GDP 2019. But that's not really strictly correct because the GDP depends both on 2019 information and also base year information. And so the choice of base year is going to make a big difference here. The GDP depends on target year and the choice of base year because, as you say, the real GDP depends on the base year. Which means if your base year and your target year are the same, the GDP deflator is 100 by definition. Right? You will have seen in you either will or have seen in tutorials for this week that we make a question on why is it that nominal GDP and real GDP have to be the same at least once. It's because when the target year and the base year are the same, then it's automatically the same number. So in the year if in the base year, the GDP deflator necessarily has to be exactly 100. And we'll see that going through in our examples, or in our example, I guess. So we depend on both target year and base year. Any questions then? Concerns? So we go through a simple example. So this is our information that we got from lecture last week, or lecture on Monday, sorry. We talk about butter and guns, where the price changes each year, and the quantity produced changes each year as well. And we get some nominal GDP. We also get, if we fix 2017 prices as our base year, then we lock in all the prices. We lock in the prices as the 2017 prices every year, and that lets us construct a notion of real GDP. So GDP, but measured in 2017 prices, fixing prices at 2017 levels. So we can grab this information, and we can use this to calculate our GDP deflator. And I should have done this in a couple of slides, but that's okay. So if we want to calculate a GDP deflator, we look at the nominal GDP and the real GDP, and we take the ratio and multiply by 100. So the ratio between 700 and 700 is 1, and then multiply by 100 to give 100. The ratio between 1500 and 1000 is 1.5, and then we multiply by 100 to get 150. The ratio between 1950 and 850 is 2.29, or is approximately 2.29, which gives a GDP deflator number, GDP deflator index of 229. So this is how we calculate this GDP deflator number, this index. The index is not, in and of itself, the index is not super important, but we can draw things from this index. Any questions? Questions, comments, problems? No, I'm using the word index here because it is an index, but no, it's GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is 100, it's 150, it's 229. All good? All clear? Easy. Now, this one's a little bit hard to see, but GDP deflator is a weighted average of price increases. One of the reasons we want to think of GDP deflator being a measure of cost of living, being a measure of prices, is that it ends up being a weighted average of price increases. And so I can show you that very briefly here. So the GDP deflator here goes from 100 to 150, and you'll notice that prices go up 50% and go up 50%. And so the GDP deflator has gone up by 50%. Yeah? So this is the context in which GDP deflator is a measure of change in price levels. If we go from 2018 to 2019, the price here goes up by a third, or from 2017 to 2019, let's say, the price here has doubled. The price of butter has doubled in that 2 years. The price of guns has more than doubled, but less than tripled. Right, it's gone up by 2.5 times in those 2 years. And so when we look at our GDP deflator, the GDP deflator is somewhere between doubling and 2.5 times. It's a weighted average of those two values. And the weights on those, the weights, if you will, of that, depend on the amount produced, are based on the amount produced. So GDP deflator, I just want to make this as a general observation. It's a weighted average of the price increases. We can think of it as a weighted average of price increases. And so it is indeed measuring changes in price. That is what this thing is measuring. And you can go through the algebra and show that more explicitly, but we can observe it in this particular case. We have more people. Welcome. I apologize for the room change and for not making it clear at all. We went to the wrong place. I went to the wrong place, at least. Okay. Any questions on GDP deflator, on the calculation structure of GDP deflator? We might have time for the end part of this. That's not a good sign. Okay, economists are, as I said, as I sort of implied in my description when I talked about GDP deflator just then, we're mostly really concerned with percentage changes in the GDP deflator. The actual number isn't that important because the number depends so sensitively on the target, on the base year. Right? The fact that this number is 100 is purely and exclusively because we chose 2017 as the base year. If we'd chosen 2019 as the base year, then this number would be 100 because the GDP deflator in the base year is 100 by definition. So we don't care so much about the particular value. We care about the change in this value between years. We care about, in particular, the percentage change between years. This reduces the effect of the choice of base year. It does not eliminate the effect of the choice of base year. You will still have some minor differences, and those differences will get larger as you get larger percentage changes. But most of the issue will go away. What I mean by this is this GDP deflator looks like it's increasing by 50%. So I could describe this either as an increase in 50%, or if I had made 2018 the base year, then this would be a decrease of 33%. Is part of the issue. Part as well is how I shouldn't have said that. Part as well is how the weighting works. It's a weighted average of price increases, and the weighting depends on the base year, the choice of base year. You need to be careful. It reduces but doesn't eliminate. So if we talk about percentage change each year, this is our percentage change formula. The GDP deflator in, have I done that wrong? That should be 18, I apologize. The percentage change in 2018 is the amount in 2018 minus the amount in 2017 divided by the amount in 2017. That gives us a 50% change, 50% increase in the GDP deflator going into 2018. Again, that is a typo. That should be 2018. We can talk about going to 2019. And again, it's the 2019 GDP deflator minus the 2018 GDP deflator, the change in GDP deflator, as a proportion of the original GDP deflator. And so we saw that GDP deflator went up by 52.6%, 52 2/3%. Yeah. And so all we're saying is that in this economy that we had, prices increased to a certain way of thinking. Prices increased by 50% in 2018, and they increased by a little over 50% in 2019. And that should accord with our intuition here. Here, all prices increased by 50%. So any measure of price increase has to say that prices increased 50%. Going from 2017 to 2018. 2018 to 2019, this price here increased by a bit less than 50%. Right? This price here increased by a third. But this increases by quite a lot more than 50%. And so the exact amount is going to be somewhere between the 1/3 increase that this does and any measure of price change is going to be somewhere between the third increase that this does and the 66%. Is that right? Yeah, 66, the 2/3 increase that this one does. And we get that, right? We find that the GDP deflator matches that, as we would expect, right? Not at all unexpectedly. So this is measuring changes in prices. The thing this is doing is, in fact, measuring changes in prices. As a homework exercise, I encourage you to compute the percentage change in GDP deflator taking 2019 as the base year rather than 2017. You'll get similar responses. This number should still say 50%, but this number will potentially be marginally different. Again, not significantly different, but it will be marginal. It will potentially be marginally different because of that different choice of base year, I believe. I don't actually run the numbers. It may work out to be the same in this particular instance, but I don't think it will. Okay, any questions? Questions, comments, problems? As part of your analysis, you choose a base year, absolutely. There's no strict requirements around what to choose as a base year. That said, there are conventions. One convention that we'll use throughout this course is you use the earliest data as your base year. Is the normal way of doing it, is to use the earliest year. If there's no other reason, if there's no particular in theoretical work, you use the earliest year. In a lot of practical work, you use 2010. 2010 has been decided upon as the base year for a lot of inflation calculations, for a lot of constant price stuff. So people tend to now just use 2010 as the year at which dollars are set as. So you'll see a lot of data, and all the data we looked at last week, all the pretty curves we looked at last week, they were all being measured in 2010 dollars. In 2010 US dollars, because that's the normal thing to use at the moment. That may change over time, but that's what we use at the moment. Does that address your concern? Otherwise, any questions about GDP deflator? Yes. Yes. Because if the prices didn't change, then if the prices were exactly the same, then the real and nominal GDPs would change in sync. So, as in the sense of, if this said if I was working out nominal GDPs, this is a hard one to say without having this is where a document camera is really handy. I'm really annoyed I didn't get one. If this value of butter, nominal value of butter, was $2 and value of guns was $1 in 2018, suppose that was the case. We did that example. Then when I ran these numbers, I would run these numbers and I would get 2 times 200 is 400, 1 times 600 is 600, so I would get a nominal GDP of $1,000 in 2018, which would be the same as the real GDP in 2018. And so when I went to work out my GDP deflator in 2018 with a base year of 2017 prices, which doesn't matter because the prices haven't changed, I would get that normal GDP is the same as real GDP. I'd get a GDP deflator of 100. I would have no, despite the fact that GDP has increased, the GDP deflator would still be the same. Because yes, GDP will have increased, but all that increase will be because of actual increases in production. And so real and nominal GDP will increase in the same amount, or in the same proportion. The same amount. Again, if I could write something down, it'd be handy. Is that okay? Well, here, if I'm doing real and nominal GDP calculations, then the production in 2018 is the production in 2018, right? The prices that I use are just prices. If I'm working out GDP in 2018, if I'm doing nominal GDP, I use 2018 prices. If I'm doing real GDP, I use base year prices. But the production amounts are the same, certainly. The argument is more, if production amounts increase, but prices stay the same, then real and nominal GDP will be the same number. They'll both increase, but they'll both increase the same amount. And so when you take the ratio between real and nominal GDP, you'll just get 100 or 1. Okay. Yes. GDPs will change, but the GDP deflator is really just trying to capture the price change component of GDP change, in the way that real GDP growth is trying to capture the production change due to GDP increases. So the production change in production. Wow. Questions? Any questions, comments, problems at this time? All that. Okay. That's the last I have on GDP deflator. Then we do CPI. Okay. The CPI is another metric, another way that we try and capture changes in the price of goods. Again, if all goods change by the same percentage change every year, or in a given year, then all of these things would be, then this sort of measure of price change would be really, really easy, because if all prices go up by 10%, then any measure that we could possibly have of price changes is going to say prices went up by 10%. The problem occurs when different goods go up by different percentages. When food goes up by 2% and health goes up by 5% and labor costs go up by 6%, right? How do we measure the aggregate price change in the economy? Is going to depend on how much we care about food versus health versus labor. And so different indexes are going to give different weightings on those different objects. And we do these for different purposes, right? For GDP deflator, we're really thinking about production, aggregate production over the entire economy, which is interesting sometimes, but not necessarily the most interesting thing. I would argue that the most interesting one is the consumer price index, and it's the most commonly used one for that reason. So the consumer price index is one of these ways of measuring price changes that's really designed to measure cost of living changes. That we're thinking now about consumers, and we're thinking about aggregate changes in price of the prices that are faced by consumers. Because from a political economy perspective, we care about prices that consumers face. So the CPI is a measure of the overall cost of the goods and services, as it says here, bought by a typical consumer, which means it's not going to include lots of stuff that goes into GDP, or some stuff at least that goes into GDP deflator. For example, exports. Exports are going to affect GDP deflator, but not affect CPI, because exports are not bought by a typical consumer. If the value of coal goes up, when the international market goes up, then the GDP deflator for Australia will be affected, but the CPI for Australia will not be affected, at least not directly. In terms of actually calculating this CPI, it's a bit more in depth. It's a bit more in depth because we don't have the background. The previous GDP deflator was actually pretty in depth. Right? You have to know how to calculate GDP, how to calculate nominal GDP versus real GDP. There was a lot of work that went into that. We just did all that work last week. The CPI, we have to do all the new extra work now. So the CPI we do by, first off, we choose a basket of what we call a basket of goods. We find the prices for those goods. We calculate the cost of the basket of goods. Choose a base year, calculate the index. And then, just like for GDP deflator, the thing we care about is not so much the CPI, but the percentage change in CPI over time. We care about how CPI is changing. And we call that percentage change the inflation rate. If you ever see anything about inflation rates, which I really hope you've seen things about inflation rates, then this is what it is. It's the percentage change in CPI. Australia's inflation rate recently was unusually low, weirdly low, like 0 in the last quarter. It was bad, which is really bad. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So, we go through those 5 steps. First off, I guess, any questions? We're going to go through these 5 steps carefully. Any questions, concerns about CPI? Excellent. So the basket of goods is just a list of the types of goods a typical consumer consumes each year and how much of that good they consume. In Australia, this is gathered by surveying consumers, by just talking to people and asking them how many apples did you buy, how many bananas did you buy, how much housing did you buy, how much healthcare did you buy. They just go and they ask about the amount of stuff that you purchase. The amount of each good purchased is going to end up being used to determine the weight placed on that particular good when we calculate the CPI. So again, we're going to be taking weighted averages like we did for GDP deflator or for GDP to a certain extent. These are going to be weighted averages in the sense that if we buy twice as many apples as oranges, then we care twice as many oranges as apples, then we care twice as much about oranges as we do about apples when we come to our calculation. And we'll do an example of this where we see this happening. Just sort of letting you know why we're choosing a basket. So we ask people what they want to buy. In Australia, this is roughly in terms of expenditure at least, which is a little bit, tiny bit different, tiny bit different. In terms of expenditure, this is the kind of stuff people buy. People spend about 22% of their income on housing in Australia, 17 on food, 12 on transport, 13 recreation, and then some other things are lower levels. Health is quite low. Education is surprisingly low. Again, this is for the average. This is for I shouldn't say average. This is for consumers on average, which means there's going to be some people that spend very large portions of their income on education, that consume lots of education, people like you guys. But there's lots of people that don't spend any of their income on education, that don't buy any education. So that number's going to be very small for a lot of people. Question? Yes. If it purchases 0, so we only list goods that are purchased. Right? Coal is not going to form anywhere in the CPI because there are no consumers that buy coal for consumption. Or very, very few, sufficiently few to make no difference. But lots of people buy furnishings. Right? Lots of people buy furnishings or household equipment and services. And so that gets included here because it's goods and services always. Anything that gets consumed 0 of, we don't include in CPI calculations. I guess you could, but you don't. We'll come to changes in the basket later. Yes, we'll come to changes in the basket of goods later. Do I say it here? I don't say it here, but I say it much later. The basket of goods, once it's chosen, is then fixed for 4 to 5 years. They go and they survey people about their spending habits, about their about their purchasing habits, about what kind of stuff they've bought. Once they have the basket, they then use that same basket for 4 or 5 years, so that you have some continuity between the years. In the same way that for GDP deflator, we had to choose a base year for prices. The CPI chooses, if you like, a base year for quantity, and it does that by taking surveys to construct this basket. This basket is the base year quantity amounts, to a certain extent. Otherwise, questions, concerns? Yes? We're talking people, not so much business. Businesses are going to be firms. They do come up in the producer price index, which I mentioned briefly, but no, we're talking about people consuming stuff for household consumption. This is the C part. This is exclusively the consumption C part of the C plus I plus G plus NX, which is, as I said, why you get differences. One of the reasons you're going to get differences between GDP deflator versus CPI. Ooh, that's a good question. The GDP deflator, the question was which is a broader index. The GDP deflator would be a broader index. It includes more stuff, but it depends what you want to use it for. If your question is cost of living for people, then you want CPI, because that's what it's doing. It's not what the GDP deflator is doing, because you don't care about cost of government services when you're thinking about cost of living. You don't care about exports when you care about cost of living. Let me get a nice pretty graph from the ABS. Okay. So now we're going to do an example calculation. So suppose we, with the ABS, we did a survey and we found surprisingly thin data. We found that in the entirety of last year, the only things that the average consumer purchased were 5 bento boxes and 2 ice creams, to make our life easy. This is going to be our step 1, is we go and we survey people and we get a basket of goods that is what the average person bought last year. Once we have that, then we need to go out and we need to find out the prices for these goods. Again, all of these steps are, we have an entire government bureau that does this because these steps are not easy. So we need to go out and find the prices. Because if you have apples, right? If I go to the shops, I can sometimes buy apples for $5 a kilo, I can sometimes buy apples for $2 a kilo. Do I choose $2 or $5 as the price of apples? You could go either way with this question. And so we have a ABS that deals with all the fiddly little bits. But we're going to ignore all those concerns. We're going to say if the ABS got their data and they said this was the price of bento boxes, these are the prices of ice cream, we want to know what is going to be the CPI in different years. So, this was the important point from previously. The items in the basket, when we're thinking about the cost of the basket, the items in that basket don't change for about 4 to 5 years. Prices are going to change every year because we want to measure change in prices, so we need to have prices change every year. But we're going to lock down what people buy so that we can effectively measure changes in prices. And so we have these prices, and so we can measure the cost of the basket of goods. Remember, people buy 5 bento boxes and 2 ice creams, and so in 2017, they spent $8 per bento box and 5 bento boxes, $3.50 per ice cream, 2 ice creams, meaning that the cost of the basket was $47. If we go to 2018, the cost of the basket increases purely because of price increases, because we've locked down the amount of goods in the basket. And so we see the $8 becomes $9.50, $3.50 becomes $4, and so we get an increase up to $55.50 as the cost of the basket of goods. Similarly in 2019, we increase the prices, and we get a new higher cost of the same baskets. We're buying the same stuff, it's costing more purely because of the price changes. This is going to allow us to extract a measure of the change in prices. Questions, problems? Those prices, from the ABS's perspective, from the statistician's perspective, they've looked at the world and found out what the prices are. Yes, the prices will be determined by supply and demand in the way we would normally think. We would normally think, the price is determined by the market. Yeah.
Thanks. The top line there says the basket was not changed year on year.
Yes.
We have used it constant throughout.
Yes.
I thought that the ABS did actually change that each year.
My understanding is that they change it every 4 or 5 years, but potentially that could be mistaken. They may have changed it on a particular. Yeah, I mean they may have changed it at the end of 2017, but they don't typically. Certainly, if you want to measure, they might do more complex things to get better measures. Is one thing as well. But the idea is you lock down the basket of goods, and then you have for the same basket of goods, you look at the price changes. Yeah. Do you have a question? Question? No. The quantities are fixed. This depends on interpretation, I guess. I would argue that the quantities are the weightings, and the prices are just changing. So it's in terms of interpretation. So we get the cost of the basket of goods. Oh yes, yeah. Between different countries, the basket will change. As I say on a couple of slides, the ABS releases CPIs for like different cities as well. And I believe they would use different baskets for different cities. I don't actually know that's the case, but you would. So yes, certainly between countries there will definitely be different baskets. The basket of goods bought by Australians will be different than the basket of goods bought by Chinese or Americans or whatever. Yes. The frequency choice will be a country policy thing. Yeah. Which, as I say, I believe in Australia is 4 to 5 years. I've read in Australia it's 4 to 5 years, but that may have changed. And they probably do a rolling process as well to make it more accurate data in any case. But yes, it'll be a country policy thing. These happen to all be increases. These are all increasing because typically prices increase and typically inflation is positive. They don't have to be. There could be reductions and you could measure deflation and have negative inflation, or you could have some prices increasing and some prices falling. It's all totally fine. Yes, absolutely. The tricky part here, so the shortcoming, do I have it now? There's a shortcoming for this that I'll come to. There is an issue that I think is rattling around the back of your mind that I will come to as the first shortcoming of CPI. Okay, so now that we have the basket cost, we want to turn our cost of baskets each year into an index, into a CPI. So we need to choose a base year. We're going to pick a year where the CPI is going to be 100. As before, we usually pick the earliest year, or 2010 if it's available, but basically we pick the earliest year. So we take the CPI in any particular year is the basket cost in that year divided by the basket cost in the base year times 100. I've got 2017 here because that's going to be the base year, but it's the basket cost in the current year, or the year of interest, divided by the basket cost in the base year, multiplied by 100 to give us an index. No great surprises, hopefully. And so we can get CPI baskets, right? The cost of the CPI in 2017 definitionally is 100 because by construction, I guess. If 2017 is the base year, then the CPI is 100 in that base year. In 2018, we take the ratio between the basket cost in 2018 and the basket cost in 2017, by 100. In 2019, we take the basket cost in 2019, divided by the basket cost in the base year, times 100, to give us our CPI in 2019. Any questions? Yep. The price is domestic prices. It's the price of whatever it is that the person buys. If it's an imported good and a person buys it, then it still is purchased. It's still part of the typical stuff that people buy. So yes, is the short answer. The price of exports doesn't appear here. Because as I said previously, if something's exported from the country, then it's not consumed. It's not part of the domestic consumer's choice of things that they buy. because it was exported, so you can't buy it. But imports are, because if you import stuff and then you consume it, then you've consumed it. So it will show up here in CPI. But it'll show up because it's part of consumption, not because it's part of imports. Okay. So, finally now, we're in the place to calculate the thing we actually want. And the thing we really, really want is inflation. And we're going to talk about inflation quite a lot throughout this section of the course. So the inflation rate is the percentage change in CPI from the previous year. No great surprises, hopefully. Using our previous information, in 2018, the inflation rate was 18%. Because the CPI went from 100 to 118, which gives us a percentage change of 18%. The inflation rate from 2018 to 2019 was about 10%, because the CPI went from 118 to 130, which is about a 10% change. So the inflation rate, was 18, and then it was 10. So we can calculate inflation rates. Again, in a place like Australia, if we got inflation rates looking like 18% or 10%, it would be horrific. That is unbelievably high. Just to give a tiny bit of background on the sort of vague levels of inflation, in Australia, we try and have an inflation rate of about 2 to 3% per year. In some places, it's a little bit higher. I know Brazil tries to target between 4 and 6% each year, or it used to at least. I think it has actually lowered its target recently. But Brazil targets 4 to 6% per year. America targets 2% per year. Different places have different, what they think of as ideal levels of inflation, but it's usually lowish single digits is the ideal amount of inflation. Some countries have very, very high inflation. The notable one at the moment is Venezuela, which has had millions of % inflation per year. Where you start measuring inflation per day, you start talking about 10 or 20% inflation per day, and you end up with millions of % over the year. It's not a good situation to be in. So 2% per year is the one Australia likes. 2 to 3% is a pretty good measure. I don't actually have Chinese data on this or Indian data on this. Does anyone know? They would have similar targets. It'll similarly target 2 or 3% inflation. I would imagine, maybe 4% in some cases. Is the kind of number we want for inflation. Any questions? Questions, problems? Yes? We don't use the cost of the basket directly. I mean, I guess you could. It's doing the same thing, right? Yeah, you could. You don't, but you could. It's not done that way, but it absolutely could be. It absolutely could be done that way. It just isn't the way we do it. I can't give you any more help than that. You absolutely could do it that way. You could use the cost of the basket directly rather than the CPI as an interim point, but the way it is done is by getting the CPI first and then using CPI as the measure. I suspect that the reason is so that if you do, say, cross-country comparison, it makes a lot more sense. It looks a bit, if we say in Australia CPI went from 100 to 105, and in China the CPI went from 100 to 105 or 104, we can make that comparison in a meaningful way. Whereas if we say a basket of goods in Australia went from $44 to $55, and a basket of goods in China went from 600 renminbi to 606, right? The disconnect is quite different. So it's handy to talk about this kind of thing as an index first. But no, you don't need to, I suppose. You could just plug in the cost of the basket directly. But we don't usually. We usually go through this CPI step. But it's a good point, and one I hadn't thought about previously. Does that adequately address your question? He's gone. We've lost her. Any other questions? Questions, comments? Yes. I believe the most recent data came out at 0.0 for the quarter. Yeah. No, inflation, well, I need to be very careful saying that, but basically no, inflation is currently lower than it should be. The inflation over the year is below 2%, and the inflation over the quarter is well below 0.5%. And so inflation is lower than the target at the moment. What does it indicate for me? It indicates that there must be some reason why the central bank has not moved to increase inflation. I don't know what that reason is, but there must be some reason why the central bank has not moved to try to push inflation higher. Because they have tools to do that, and the fact that they're not implementing those tools has to be for some reason. Again, I don't know what the reason is, but there will be some reason why they're choosing to do it that way. I feel like that was an appropriately politically accurate answer. Yes. Does that make sense? That's, yes. Otherwise, any questions? Problems? Okay. Yes, so as I said previously, CPI is measured both for the nation, but also in Australia, at least for a few different sort of sub-regions, for a few capital cities. Because if you live in Sydney, you don't really care about price changes in Perth. Right? Maybe price changes are massive in Perth, but low in Sydney, and you're happy. Or maybe vice versa, as is actually the case at the moment. We also calculate a few different price indexes, because some of these we can combine together to form the CPI anyway, so it can be useful. So we may as well report as well these sub-indexes. So we can talk about things like the inflation rate on food, right? How fast price of food is changing. We can talk about the inflation rate as it applies purely to clothing or purely to health. And so you observe a lot of stuff, and you do observe notable differences here, right? Cost of clothing is falling. There is deflation in the cost of clothing. The cost of education and healthcare is increasing much, much faster than the posted inflation rate. So we do get differences between these bundles. And the most recent one, food, I think, went up, but by a lot less than it should have. I think food was one of the key drivers that meant that inflation didn't increase to the extent that it should have in the last period. We can also talk about, because consumer price index is just for consumers, we might care about the cost of production as well. So we can talk about the producer price index. And so the producer price index does exactly the same thing, but it surveys firms and asks firms what firms have to buy, and then creates a typical basket of goods for the typical firm and does the whole work previously, but with a different basket of goods. And so that'll include coal. That'll include certain types of IT services. That'll include lots of other things that aren't part of CPI. The producer price index is actually quite nice because it tends to, and I don't have data on this at the moment, which I should have, it tends to preempt the consumer price index, because costs of production then tend to flow through after time into cost of goods. If the producer price index is really high or increasing really fast, so if the costs of production are increasing really fast, that's going to tend to flow through into increasing cost of consumer goods in the next period. This is still an interesting object, even if it isn't an interesting object when thinking about cost of living, even though it's not measuring cost of living, because CPI today tends to be pretty closely related to the PPI yesterday or last period. Okay, any questions, problems? The level at which we're fine is largely, well, Australia has decided that 2 to 3% is a good level of inflation. Other countries have decided on slightly different numbers. Brazil has the highest moderate target that I know of, which is 6%, 4 to 6%, or 5 to 6%, is unusually high. So basically, the economists have looked at lots and lots of data and have decided that a 2 to 3% level is pretty good. The conditions that we have basically are that high inflation is really, really bad. Really high inflation is bad because it destroys savings and it distorts decisions because you can't save money. Negative inflation is absolutely terrible because you can't operate a proper monetary policy. You can't operate monetary policy very well. Negative inflation is very, very bad, so we want to try and avoid negative inflation. And so what you want is as low as you can get, you want inflation to be as low as you can get, and at a level where you can still control it but at a level you can still control it so that random fluctuations don't push it below zero. That's the calculus people have in their mind. We want it to be low, but we know there's going to be shocks to it. We know it's going to move around without our control. And we really don't want to have it go below zero. We want it sort of close to zero, but with a little bit of buffer room, so that when shocks happen, it doesn't go below zero. In Australia, we reckon we have a pretty strong central bank, and so we can pick a target of 2 to 3%. In Brazil, they have a weaker central bank, so they pick 4 to 6%, as in it's going to be slower to respond and not as effective in its response, they think. They pick 4 to 6% as their target. But it's largely, as long as you have a target and as long as you have stable, lowish inflation, the level of inflation doesn't matter too much, as long as it's lowish and as stable as possible. And 2 to 3% seems like a good one to us. Americans, I think, have 2%, as I say. There's not really good reasons. If there were really good reasons, everyone would have the same target. The fact that people have different targets means there's not really, really good reasons for a specific number. Does that answer your question? I feel like I over-answered. Excellent. And you had a question as well? Yeah. You would think of producer price index. They'd be purchasing not only raw materials, but raw materials, intermediate goods, really anything that they have to buy. Wages as well. Wages will also show up in this. It's not related to what, sorry? The producer price index, but the cost of most inputs will flow through. It's not going to be related to GDP, but it's going to be because this is also more of a cost thing, not a production thing. If stuff costs lots to produce, if the cost of the inputs to production is increasing, then I'm going to have to sell my goods for more money at the end of the day in order to remain profitable. And so, if we have high producer price index, if the producer price index, is growing swiftly, then we would expect the consumer price index to also start growing swiftly in the future. Okay, CPI problems. I don't want to talk about CPI problems because there's 3 I want to talk about. The first one was already brought up, which is substitution bias. So this is this idea of we pick a basket and we fix it for 4 to 5 years. But if prices change a lot, and most prices don't, but if prices were to change a lot, then we're going to change our choice of consumption. And so, sure, bananas became super duper expensive last year. Or briefly early this year, I should say. But my cost of living did not increase significantly because I just stopped buying bananas. I actually have this the other way around here. Yeah. If bananas are cheap when the basket is chosen, so the basket's chosen in 2017, let's say bananas are $1 a kilo or $1.50 a kilo, and I'm buying 4 kilos a week because I actually legitimately really like bananas. So I'm buying 4 kilos a week, and then the price jumps and is now $10 a kilo. And and from the CPI calculation perspective, this is a huge increase in cost. But from an actual cost of living perspective, I just stopped buying bananas. And it doesn't matter to me at all that the cost has increased. The cost could increase to $100 a kilo or $1,000 a kilo because I'm just not buying them anymore. So this substitution bias is going to be very, very important. As things become more expensive, we tend to buy less of them. This is our law of demand. And so we would think that, and so because of this effect, but the CPI doesn't take that into account. The CPI, because it locks the basket, it says the price went up, but we're going to assume you're still buying the same amount of that good. This means the CPI necessarily overestimates the change in the cost of living, right? Because it doesn't allow for the fact that you adjust how much of stuff you buy so that you're buying cheaper goods, because it has a fixed basket of goods. And it is a real and serious shortcoming of the CPI. I'm not defending this. This is a problem. This is why you might have rolling behavior, where they might update differently. But in the standard model, this is a significant shortcoming.
One issue is new goods, right? When a new good comes onto the market, then the new good weekly increases the standard of living. A new good on the market can't make you worse off because you can always just not buy it. But a new good could make you better off because if it's better than what you're using currently, or it's new and you're happy to pay for it, then it'll make you better off. Which means new goods necessarily increase the standard of living, but new goods, because, again, we have that fixed basket, new goods are not included in CPI calculation. We don't see the new goods showing up anywhere in our CPI because we have a fixed basket of goods. And so people are better off, standard of living is increased, which is to say, to a certain extent, cost of living has fallen, but the CPI isn't taking that into account. And so once again, the CPI is overestimating the change in the cost of living. You could, I guess, have a flip side of this, which is like lost goods or the removal of goods or services from the economy, which would cause CPI to underestimate the change in the cost of living. But that's obviously much less prevalent. We don't really see goods and services leaving the economy so much. We tend to think of new goods and services being produced, new types of goods and services being produced. And lastly, and then we'll do questions, is improvements in quality. So quality improvements do increase standard of living. If you just have better stuff now, there are quality improvements, increase standard of living. You can account for this to a certain degree, but it's difficult. But in any case, we're going to be thinking of this leading to the CPI again, overestimating the change in the cost of living. Because if our services are just better than they were, then our standard of living is increased. Another way of saying that is our cost of living has fallen, but the CPI isn't taking that into account. Because it's just saying, previously you purchased a phone, and now you've purchased a phone, and it's a much better phone, right? It's an improvement in your standard of living, but it's still just a phone, right? So the CPI is going to overestimate the change in the cost of, got a bit lost there. CPI, we're going to overestimate the change in the cost of living. And again, reductions in quality will cause the opposite effect, but we tend to think of that not being a major part of our economy. Reductions in quality, we tend to think of not being a major part of our way of looking at the world. Okay, questions. So all these effects, are mostly causing us to have CPI overestimating the change in the cost of living.
Just for clarification, given that there's an increasing move from a goods economy to a services-led economy, just an observation here that the substitution bias appears to be more inclined towards goods and not services.
I wouldn't say that. When I talk about goods, if I use the word goods, I always mean goods and services. In any time I say goods, in economic speak, you wouldn't even, if I was in the department talking to other economists, you would never use the word goods and services. You would just say goods, because it's implied to mean anything people are buying, which includes services. Substitution bias is still going to be a service effect. If plumbing services become really expensive, I'm going to buy less of it. If electrician services become really cheap, I'm going to buy more of it. If you're thinking of those kinds of services. If healthcare becomes really cheap, I'm going to buy more of it. If education becomes expensive, I might buy less of it. So the same substitution bias definitely affects services as well. What you might be thinking of is something like, particularly education and healthcare, I guess, as well, is that what we observe is increasing prices and increasing consumption. Is that your concern?
Yes. And also what you don't observe, which is this tangible aspect of digital economy as well,
Software stuff is tricky because the price is so low anyway, depending on what kind of digital stuff you're talking about. Digital stuff often comes into this idea of improvements in quality. My computer, because there's a new free program's been released, or there's a new website that I really like, my computer is now better in terms of it does more for me. It's been improved. Its quality has been improved. So I would put that mostly in improvements in quality rather than anywhere else. It's still an issue, yes. Otherwise, questions, comments, problems? Yeah. Yep. Yep. My short answer is probably I wouldn't. If you were using less power, because, I mean, it wouldn't show up here. It may be an improvement in quality, potentially, but otherwise, yeah, otherwise you wouldn't. You would just say it's a different type of shortcoming, which is because I have this, because this object has become cheaper, I use less of, because it's improvements in quality in this object over here means I consume less of this thing over here, means I have to consume less of this. So it's probably, it would come under improvements in quality, if anywhere, or just a different type of shortcoming. These are not necessarily meant to be exhaustive. These are some of the shortcomings of CPI. There are shortcomings related to inequality, right? The CPI is going to be very different. The change, the effective inflation is going to be very different for someone who's on the poverty line versus someone who's very wealthy, because the bundle of goods they consume is different. So there are other shortcomings of CPI, but these are some of them. There are, I should be clear on that. There are very few shortcomings, if any, that cause CPI to underestimate the change in the cost of living for the average consumer. CPI really should be thinking mostly of as being an overestimate of the cost of living. Yeah. Yes. I'd have to double check. I believe it has a positive bias, but I would have to double check to make sure of that, make sure the logic still flows for all of these things. But I believe the interpretation would be it has a positive bias. It pushes higher. Yeah. Okay. We're going to be fine for time. Anyway. Okay, CPI and GDP deflator. Obviously it should be GDP, because GP deflator is not a thing. So, CPI and GDP deflator. They are different, as for reasons we talked about. They will usually tell the same story, right? They're both things are trying to measure changes in the purchasing power of money. Changes in how much you can get for the same amount of money. Changes in prices. So they should, in most cases, look pretty similar. And if you go to data, they basically always look pretty similar. There are some differences, but they look pretty similar most of the time. Differences are, as we talked about, that exports are part of GDP deflator, but are not part of CPI. Similarly, imports are part of CPI because you import then consume, whereas they're not really actually part of the GDP deflator because they cancel out in GDP deflator because you import them and then consume them. One difference is the CPI basket is fixed for some years, whereas for GDP deflator, the amount of goods changes. So if you have dramatic shifts in the amount of goods being produced or consumed, then the CPI basket is going to look a bit strange. It's going to not be a very good measure. You're going to want to think about GDP deflator more, but typically the amount of goods produced and consumed don't radically change year on year. In most cases, for most goods, etc., etc. So they're very similar, but they're not exactly the same, and there will be differences. Any questions? CPI, that's what I have. CPI and GDP deflator. I mean, I have more stuff, obviously, but any questions on CPI versus GDP deflator? Should be similar. They're trying to do the same thing. So. All right. Correcting for inflation. So money today is, due to inflation, money today is not worth the same as money in the past. And so we have a question. Is $1,000 today worth more or less than $100 in 1970? $1,000 today is worth, we have a less. Who reckons $1,000 today is worth less than $100 in 1970? Hands right up. Hands right up for less. Hands right up for more. Couple. Hands right up for pretty similar. All right, let's find out. The way we find out is we go to our inflation calculator. And so $100 in 1970 is worth the same as, I don't know if it likes 2019, so I'm going to put in 2018 here. $1,000 in 1970 is worth $1,159 today. It was pretty close. I'm going to argue pretty close. I picked the number so that it was pretty close. But $100 today, $1,000 today is worth slightly less than $100 in 1970, because $1,150 today is worth the same as $100 in 1970. Most countries have these kinds of inflation calculators, or most currencies, I should say, have these kinds of inflation calculators. You can always use them. I would encourage using these rather than trying to fiddle around yourself. This is just much easier. For Australia, you need to be very, very careful. This will only go back to 1966 in Australia, because prior to that we had pounds and shillings and didn't have decimal currency. So we had like 12 shillings to the pound. No, 20 shillings to the pound. 12 pence to the shilling and 20 shillings to the pound, because of course we did. But this information, these calculators are quite useful. So money today is worth different amounts than money in the past. In Australia, over the last 40 years, it's about 10 times. The difference is about 10 times from 1970 to today. Any questions? Questions, issues? Okay. Indexation is a process where some nominal dollar amount is automatically adjusted for inflation. This is something called indexing for inflation, or indexation. Most of you who have rental agreements in the ACT are partially indexed, or are indexed to a certain extent. So rental agreements in the ACT work something like they can increase by no more than inflation plus 2%, I think, per year. There are strict legal limits based around inflation. This is not super uncommon, but ACT is pretty good for renters, relatively speaking, because we have these kinds of price controls, right? Reasonable price controls of inflation plus X%. I think it's 2%. Often wages are indexed to inflation. So often wages say the wage will be inflation, you'll get your current wage plus inflation plus 0.5% or something like that. In Australia, because inflation is really actually pretty stable almost always, a lot of things build in a notion of inflation, which is 2% increases per year, 2% or 3% increases per year. The ANU just did its wage renegotiation recently and said it's a 2% increase per year. If you stay at the same level, don't get promoted, you get a 2% increase in pay every year, which is essentially indexing for inflation. The intent is to index for inflation. Okay, questions, concerns, problems? This is all we have on cost of living. Okay. So now we move on and we talk a little bit about inequality, but in particular, really we're going to be talking about production functions. So when we looked on Monday, we looked at a big pile of data which really argued that GDP per capita was very, very different between different countries. GDP was very different between different countries, we didn't show that much of, but in particular GDP per capita, very different between different countries. And so we want to think about why this happens. First off, it's definitely not population. There's no sense in which this could be population, because if we're looking at GDP per capita, we've divided by the number of people. So higher population will have higher GDP, but then you divide by number of people, so we get rid of that as an option. That means that what has to be different is how much each person produces, is the amount of production done by each individual. And so we're going to talk about this as differences in productivity. So productivity measures productivity measures the value of goods and services an average worker produces with 1 hour of work. I had deep concerns about my claim just then. Oh. It could. You could, definitely. So yes. So I say must be. An option is differences in productivity, which is differences in production per hour. You could have differences in number of hours worked. This is notable because there was a release very, very recently which looked at differences in number of hours worked, which was a lot higher than I would have thought between countries. So they noted the Americans worked the longest hours, I believe. No, it was a huge number. It was like 500 hours more than Germany, I believe. On a weekly, yeah. On an annual basis, the Americans work something like 500 hours more than the average German, which to me is just insane. That's so much more. But that's what it was. That was the difference. So number of hours worked could also come up here. You want to be very careful with number of hours worked, because if you track productivity over number of hours worked, it caps out at about 8 hours a day anyway. Working more than 8 hours a day tends to cause you actually to produce less, not less per hour, just less. So you need to be careful arguing that side. But yes, it is an issue. It is an option. Okay. Otherwise, questions, problems? Okay. So let's talk about productivity and what kinds of things we think might determine productivity. And we're going to talk about three main ones. Again, number of people is definitely not going to determine productivity, because we're talking about how much one person makes in 1 hour. Number of hours worked is not going to affect productivity, because it's the amount that a worker makes in 1 hour. So the key things that we're going to think about as affecting productivity are going to be human capital, physical capital, and technology. There are potentially other things, but certainly from a modeling perspective, these are the only ones we're ever going to model, because we want to think about these three being the big three, the main three that make the vast majority of the effect. And so we'll go through those three things. Human capital, hopefully you've seen these terms somewhere before. Human capital is the knowledge and skills that a worker acquires through education, training, and experience. So you guys are in this room now, or you guys are not so much in this room now, but you guys are at the university. Part of the reason you're here is to increase your own personal stock of human capital, so that later on you can become more productive and therefore get paid more, but also be more productive, right? Be more beneficial to society. Because higher levels of human capital allow workers to produce more value per hour of work. If you have more human capital, you can produce more value in a single hour. The example that they always give is always programming, because it's a really, really clear example where it's really just human capital that's doing all of the heavy lifting. So a skilled programmer with a good theoretical knowledge from their university and good practical skills from experience can produce a computer program unbelievably faster than I can. Right? I might be able to do it, but a program that takes me 100 hours to write would take someone who's properly skilled and knows what they're doing maybe 20 minutes. 30 minutes, right? The difference in time for programming can be ridiculously large between someone who knows what they're doing and someone who basically doesn't know what they're doing, like me. But there's not like you're working with different programs. You're working with the same programs. So you're working with the same physical capital, you're working with the same technology, you have access to all the same stuff. It's just that the programmer knows more than I do, has better skills. So human capital is going to be very, very important here. Going to be very, very important in lots of circumstances. Any questions, comments, problems? Okay. Obviously, physical capital is going to be important as well. It's not just how much you know, it's also what you have to work with. So physical capital is the stock of equipment, machines, and structures that are used to provide goods and services, or used to produce goods and services. The general rule, again, more physical capital lets workers become more productive. If I think about, do I do this? Yes. If I have this lecture room, the fact that we have this lecture room, even though it's not our normal lecture room, the fact that we have a lecture room at all means that I get to give one lecture to everyone instead of having to give 5 lectures or 10 lectures to smaller groups. Right? And so I become 10 times more productive because we have access to this nice, big, specially produced room rather than having to have smaller groups that we talk to individually. I say 20 here, but probably more like 10 smaller groups. So that increases my productivity 10 times. A skilled programmer could write a program without access to a computer. But you can sit down on pen and paper, and you do this in exam. If you do computer science exams, or even in high school exams, they make you sit down with a pen and paper and write out a program. And you can do it, but it's not good. It's really slow. It's really unproductive. If you give that person a computer, then they can do this much more quickly. So access to physical capital is going to make our lives much easier. You can talk about goods production as well, right? A person working in the very, very classical example is the production of needles, right? Pins. A person working in a pin factory with all the physical capital of a pin factory can produce millions of pins per day. An individual working on their own, a really skilled pinsmith working on their own, produces, 10 pins per day. So physical capital makes a huge difference in the productivity of people, of workers. Any questions? Questions, comments? Okay. And lastly, we want to talk about technology. And technology is a tricky one because it's the ephemeral one. It's the one that's not quite, it's not how much stuff we have. It's not how much education we have. It's all the other stuff. It's the systems that we use. So technology is a measure of how well we combine inputs together. So we're not thinking about how much we know, but how well we can use that knowledge, right? The fact that our systems mean that we put a really good programmer together. We know to put a really good programmer together with the kind of computer that they can program well on. We know to put lecturers in lecture rooms, right? So use of knowledge. We can talk about better organization of resources, right? We had a really, really terrible technological fault this morning when we went to the wrong room and we lost 10 to 15 minutes of lecture time because we didn't have good organization of our resources. Wasn't that handy? The big change that happened, so I want to talk about two big changes in technology as the notion of technology. The first big one, which I mentioned just before, is the notion of the production line. So this is way, way back, and there's the pin example I brought up, which is that if you introduce a production line, rather than having one person making a pin, you have a production line. You have one person who makes the stem, and one person who makes it flatter, and one person who makes the head, and one person who makes the metal, and one person... You have lots of people all with little tiny jobs. Then you create a production line, and you can become massively more productive by doing this. It makes the jobs much more boring, makes the jobs much worse, but it makes them much more productive. This is not that you're giving people new tools. It's not that you're requiring higher skilled work, you're actually requiring less skilled work. It's that you're introducing a better way of combining the technology, the inputs that you already have by introducing this production line. This is like a 1750s kind of change, right, that we started making way, way back then. It's super early. You look worried, you're like, Production line, the moving production line is 1900s. The production line is 1750s. The more recent one, that's actually very recent, is what we call just-in-time, for retail stores, is just-in-time retail logistics. So retail shops used to stock a decent amount of stock. They used to have a back room where there'd be stuff stored in the back. And they don't anymore, because you don't have to anymore, because we have this just-in-time retail logistics, which is that everything is developed, the technology has been developed, so that when you run out of something, the systems have been put in place so that when you run out of tins of tomatoes, there's already, that's the day when new tins of tomatoes arrive and you put them on the shelf. And so there's no need for storage. There's no time when stuff is sitting around there's no need for storage, there's no time stuff is sitting around not being used. And the prevalence of shortages of goods is a lot lower because big supermarkets particularly have worked out exactly how much they're going to need at each different time. And so they don't keep things in storage for any amount of time, or for as little time as possible, and they don't have shortages of goods for any time, or at least for as little time as possible. This is a huge improvement. This is one of the main reasons we talk about big supermarkets being relatively cheap, because they can do this. Okay. The argument is better technology allows the economy to use its labor and capital more efficiently. The last thing I want to mention before I move on from technology is that in practical work, when you're doing like econometrics, technology is just the and everything else category, right? It's that we know labor matters, we know capital matters, and there seems to be something else that also matters, and we're going to call that something else that also matters technology. And we're not going to look too deeply into what it is. We're going to include things like retail logistics and better use of resources and so on and so forth. But really, we're just going to put that to the side and say it's technology and not worry too much about what's in that box. So anything that's going to affect GDP, or affect productivity, I should say, that isn't labor, isn't capital, isn't human capital, we're going to call technology. Go for the next one. Any questions? Okay. Very quickly, not to harp on about this one at all, natural resources are an input into production. They're inputs that are provided by nature, so we're talking about our land, our rivers, our mineral deposits. Land used to be a big part of all of our macroeconomics, but because it's not that important anymore, we've kind of dropped it off entirely from our question of macroeconomic questions. There are renewable natural resources, there are non-renewable natural resources. Natural resources are usually good for economic development. But having large coal deposits was really handy for Australia's economic development, but they're by no means necessary for good economic outcomes. The key example of this is Singapore, though to a lesser extent, though also something like Hong Kong would have a similar argument. No natural resources at all, right? Tiny islands, no natural resources, but still have good economic outcomes. So natural resources are usually good, but they're by no means necessary to receive good economic outcomes. The other thing is that you can have too much of a particular kind of natural resource. So too much of certain types of natural resources tend to be very, very bad. So you end up with what's called the resource curse, which is also sometimes called the paradox of plenty, but I've mostly seen it called the resource curse. Lots of countries in Africa have the resource curse, which is, Angola is probably the biggest one of these. Angola produces oil and diamonds. That's the main export of that country. The problem is there's so much money to be made by exporting oil and diamonds that no other domestic industries can be developed. So all you have is a country exporting oil and diamonds. The next problem is that if all your money is coming from exporting oil and diamonds, whoever controls the oil and diamonds has all the power, which means you have horrendously unstable political climates, because one day one warlord controls the oils and diamonds and has all the power, and the next day there's a coup and the new person is put in charge of the oil and diamonds, and then there's another coup, and then there's a civil war, and you see where I'm going with this. You get terribly, terribly unstable political climates in a lot of these circumstances. It doesn't have to be all that bad. The big one here is Dutch disease, is a resource curse as well, which was not so much political instability, it was really more, I can't remember what they produced now. They were able to produce oil, I think? Gas. They were able to use gas very, very cheaply, and so that meant that their internal economy collapsed a little bit, or not collapsed, their internal economy weakened because they were making so much money exporting gas. And then when the gas price falls, then you're stuffed because you don't have the internal economy, internal production to be able to deal with not having huge amounts of money coming in from gas. This was the fate of Venezuela as the most recent example of this. Made huge amounts of money through oil, was doing fantastically based on the oil export revenue, but because they were making so much money from oil, the internal economy couldn't compete with that, and so they became quite weak, and then oil prices drop, and the economy, in Venezuela's case, collapses almost entirely. Yes, it's definitely, yeah. Yes. Yes, if you have a good range of natural resources, then you'll be okay. If you have, like Australia, for example, yes, or America or China, if you have certain kinds of natural resources are much more resilient to the resource curse, and certain kinds are obviously then much more likely to cause resource curse. Diamonds are particularly bad for resource curses, right? Because you get a single mine that produces a huge amount of money, and so whoever controls that mine has the power. Whereas coal, having a coal mine is great, but there's also 50 other coal mines in the country, and just because you control one doesn't mean you control all of them. If you do control all of them and try and exploit that power, maybe there's other powers involved as well that might take that coal away from you. But there's enough other stuff. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay, what have we got left? 7 minutes. We'll be right. We can get through it. So now, because now we just have a bit of light mathematical modelling, nothing too strenuous. So, and the aggregate production function for an economy is the relationship between the inputs to production and the outputs of the country. Output in our context here is going to be we're going to think of output as GDP. We don't have to, but it's GDP or it's income. As we talked about on Monday, production, income, expenditure are all the same. So we can think of output either as income for the country or whatever, or as production. Our important factors of production, as always, are going to be labour, amount of work hours, average human capital, which we're going to use lowercase h to denote the average level of human capital in our society, physical capital, which is going to be K for capital, partly because C is consumption, but also partly because the letters are decided by the Germans, and the Germans use K for the word capital. And technology is going to be given by the letter A for reasons I do not know. In principle, GDP could be any function of these 4 input values, but we're not going to be that general. We're going to be pretty general. We're not going to be quite that general. We're going to take labour and human capital, and we're going to combine those into total efficiency units of labour. So we're not thinking just about number of hours worked, but the effective number of hours worked, if you like, or the efficiency number of hours worked. And so we take labour, number of hours worked, multiply it by average human capital level to get the efficiency unit of labour. And we're going to use capital H for that. We're also going to assume that technology is sort of separate from the others, in that we can pull technology out, and that our production is going to be just, the production is the technology level multiplied by some function of capital and effective labour. We're not going to lock down what that function is. I will in a bit. I will talk about common things in a bit. We're not going to lock it down explicitly. We are going to, though, pull technology out the front and then say it's the technology level times some function of capital and effective labour. Yes. Y is output, A is technology, H is units of labour, K is capital, and F is some function which links capital, which links this, which makes this equation true. Any questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Aggregate production function. Yes. How to measure it? We will give it as a numeric value. It is a numeric value. For one thing, it is a numeric value. How we measure it is difficult. It comes from this argument that I said here, which is that in practice technology is the catch-all term for all the other stuff. So you don't measure technology directly. The way you get technology, the way you get the measure of technology in a country, in not quite in econometrics, but certainly in macro, is you measure the level of physical capital, you measure the level of effective human hours, somehow, you measure the level of output, and from that you deduce the technology level. So you get the technology level because you know what all these other things are. You know what Y, K, and H are. And so A equals Y divided by F of KH is the way you calculate this value. In this, we actually just totally ignore natural resources in our aggregate production function here. We do that partly because, we do that for a number of reasons. The main reason we do it is because that's the standard way it's done. You might include it as, it's not part of capital. It's definitely not part of capital. It's not included. It's not included because it seems like it doesn't matter that much. In most economies, when you do the econometrics and you test whether this model works pretty well, you find this model works pretty well, and the level of natural resource doesn't really seem to make much difference in terms of aggregate production. Yep. Yes. All the land, so land in older models, if you see any models from like the 70s or 80s or before that, obviously, they include land. They include 3 major factors: physical capital, effective human or labor hours, and land as an extra factor of production. Land as a factor of production has fallen off as a thing in our modelling because it seems not to matter that much. It seems like it just doesn't really matter how much land there is in the country. As I say, Singapore has high GDP per capita, but very, very little land. What's a good example? Western Sahara is not quite a country, but it's nearly a country. Has masses of land and virtually no people and very low GDP per capita. So it just doesn't seem like land really matters that much for GDP. It's a good question, though. I like the question, but yeah, it turns out land doesn't matter that much. Any questions? Okay, well, actually no questions because I need to get through it. We're going to make some assumptions. We're not going to be incredibly general. We're going to assume that more capital means we get more production. Yeah? It's simple. We're going to assume that more effective labour hours means you get more production. We're going to also assume this diminishing marginal product in both labour and capital, which is to say that as we have more, I'd draw a picture if I had a bloody screen that I could show, which means that as we have more capital, each extra unit of capital gives less benefit. Right? Each extra unit of capital is still good, but we have this diminishing marginal product. Same way we had diminishing marginal utility, we now have diminishing marginal product. More capital is good, more labour is good, but it's less effective the more and more of it that we have. So you have diminishing marginal product of labour and diminishing marginal product of capital. The most commonly used form of this in sort of intro macro stuff is this form here, where output is A times K to the third, H to the 2/3. These number of third and 2/3 are data-driven numbers. When we look at data, these numbers seem like they should be a third and 2/3, roughly. It's actually not quite true anymore, but it used to be the case. These numbers should be a third and 2/3. And this has all our nice properties. What's my screen? This has all the nice properties that we expect, which is to say that more capital is good.